Okay, let's begin by looking at some of the research. So what are the problems that prevent us from being more effective with bullying and cyberbullying prevention? The first problem is that the word bullying is a vastly overused term. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and you know that kids and sometimes adults tend to overuse the term to refer to anything that hurts anybody's feelings, even a little bit. So what is bullying? Bullying is a behavior between two kids that has four characteristics. It's a very specific kind of problem. Bullying is something that is intentional. It's not an accident. It is something that is repetitive. It's not somebody being mean once, even if they're being mean in a severe way once. Bullying is a situation where a person or a group of people start an ongoing campaign against a target. 3, there has to be a power imbalance between the kids. So it has to be a situation where the bully feels powerful, but the target may not feel like they can defend themselves. Now, the source of that power can be many things. It could theoretically be physical size, although that's much less common than it used to be. I'll talk about that in a minute. It can also be social status, which is probably most common today. Finally, the target has to care. It has to be impactful. And this might surprise you to learn, but actually a reasonable amount of the time, targets of bullies don't care so much about what's going on. These are what we call resilient kids. They're really important. I'll talk more about them in a minute. Now notice, notice when we look at the definition of bullying, it doesn't talk about specific behaviors. So it doesn't say things like, well, if you're being excluded, that's more serious than if somebody is just looking at you or if somebody is laughing at you. It doesn't require there to be physical bullying. Specific behaviors are not part of the definition. The issue with bullying, what makes something bullying, isn't this behavior or that behavior. It's the context of the behavior. Is the behavior happening repeatedly? Is it intentional? Is there a power imbalance? Those are the kinds of questions that give us the context. Now we know that bullying has a much larger emotional impact than other kinds of social problems. That's why we care about it so much. That's why it matters to figure out if something is bullying or not. As you can see, kids who were victims of bullying showed a much greater emotional impact from the social problem than kids who were fighting with their friends, for example. Now, how well does this whole rubric work when we're talking about digital behaviors? And then we're talking about something really different. And how does this whole idea of understanding the context work when you're online or when you're talking about problems online? So we did this study where we looked at different kinds of digital problems between kids. We looked at really severe problems, and then we looked at really mild problems. An example of a severe problem might be, for example, somebody who distributes a naked photo of somebody else without their permission. That would be a severe incident. A minor incident could be something like posting a photo of a friend that you think is really funny and not mean at all, but it's kind of embarrassing to your friend. That would be an example of a minor incident. So if you look at these two types of incidents, what determines if they really are emotionally impactful to the target? So in the severe incidents, you can first look at the orange line, and that shows you if the severe incidents happens once, there's still a reasonable number of kids who will say it has a really big impact on them. If it happens repeatedly, suddenly more kids are reporting that it has a really big impact. However, if they're also being targeted at school, now suddenly they have an even bigger impact. So the severity of digital kinds of problems may be partly determined by what's happening in your life in general. If you're feeling good about school and things are going well and you have friends there, you may not feel that what happens online is so important. Now, what about if the incident is really minor? Well, we found that the exact same pattern occurs. When the incidents were minor, almost no kids told us that if it just happened once, it was still really impactful. Remember, these are minor incidents. If they happen repeatedly, now we're beginning to see more kids saying they're really being impacted. But if they're also having social problems at school, now suddenly there's a big increase in the kids who see it as impactful. So you could have potentially somebody who has a really minor incident online, but because they're having so many social problems in other areas of their lives, it still has a really big impact on them. Again, it's all about the context. Now, what about fighting versus bullying? What are some of the differences? Probably the biggest difference is the power imbalance. Fighting can be something that's ongoing. It's usually intentional. It can be something that has a really big impact on both kids, but you don't have that power imbalance where the target really feels like they're totally powerless and they can't rescue themselves at all. Sometimes we call that conflict. Sometimes we call it fighting. It's kind of the same thing. Then there's just being mean. And just being mean is when you're just being mean to somebody once. It's not repetitive. It's not going on and on. Maybe it's an accident. You're not thinking before you say something. Maybe you're just in a bad mood. Maybe you're having, you're mad at somebody else, things like that. Then there's what we call unsuccessful bullying. And that is when a kid is trying to bully somebody, but the person doesn't care. The target is really too resilient. They don't care what that bully thinks, or they just stick with their friends and they feel okay. But in any case, it's not really working. Now, another thing that's wrong with bullying prevention is that it's changed so much. So a lot of the bullying prevention techniques that we still talk about today were developed back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And at that time, they might have been pretty good ideas. But back then, bullying was partly physical, partly psychological. Today, it's almost always psychological. There's still some physical bullying left, but it's much less common than it used to be. This is partly because of digital technology, but also partly, I think, because adults just are not as tolerant about physical aggression as they used to be between kids. The third problem and the third thing that I think is wrong with bullying prevention today has been the shift to digital technology. So the shift to digital technology, the influence of social media, gaming, and other kinds of digital environments that kids find themselves in has had an enormous impact on child development. It's had an enormous impact on social development. And it's really important to try to understand this. Now, we're not just talking about cyberbullying here. We're talking about all the digital behaviors that kids engage in and how these have developed their social development, how these have influenced their social development. The fourth problem that I think with bullying prevention today is that when we look at these digital problems, we tend to assume they're only about the older kids, but we know that that's not true. And we know that, in fact, most of the change that's happening right now among the use of digital technology is happening among the younger kids, among elementary school kids, not among teenagers. So I'm going to show you some of the data from 2010. This is data on how many kids in elementary school own cell phones. Own and carry their own cell phones. Those are the third graders. So you can see that they've increased 5-fold since 2010. These are the fourth graders, and these are the fifth graders. So cell phone ownership is pretty common among elementary school kids today. However, American children are not the most wired by a long shot. And in fact, there were South Korean children in this study as well. So I compared them to these American children, and I found the South Korean children were far more likely to own cell phones. In fact, the South Korean third graders were more likely to own cell phones than the American fifth graders. So that was quite a dramatic difference. And I think one of the differences, though, is that I think in some other places, they're making more of an effort to talk to kids about how to use these devices in a way that's safe and healthy for them. And I'm not sure that we have really tried to do that as much as we could. And that may be why we're seeing some of the problems that we're seeing. And I will talk about those later. The fifth problem with bullying prevention is that some of the solutions that we've come up with, like some of our assumptions about bullying, are kind of outdated, and they really aren't effective. So for example, one of the most common problems we see, or that kids tell us about, is when kids try to talk to adults about bullying and adults don't ask about context. So they say, for example, what is he doing to you? Or what is she doing to you? But they don't ask things like, has this happened before? Have you had problems with them before? How many times has it happened? Are there other kids involved in it? Who else was around when he or she did this to you? Those kinds of questions are really, really important, because unless you understand about the context of the behavior, you might mistakenly think that the behavior is just no big deal, or that it's really serious. Either way, the mistake can happen. So it's really important to ask about context. Another solution that we tend to prescribe to children is not incorrect exactly. It's kind of more the way we talk about it. So we really tend to push kids to tell adults when they're being bullied. Now, this isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. But telling an adult is not likely to just always instantly solve a bullying situation. Sometimes adults can solve bullying situations. Sometimes they can't. And sometimes they can only solve it a little bit. And sometimes there are better strategies that adults can coach kids in rather than adults just taking over a situation. So focusing on only telling adults, on saying to kids, just tell an adult, kind of implies that the adults think that just telling an adult is going to solve all their problems. Think about it from the perspective of who helps kids feel better. So if somebody is being mean to a child, who's going to make that child feel better? Will the adults make them better? Will the other kids make them better? Who really has the power in this situation? It's really the other kids who have the power in that situation. We actually did a really interesting experiment on this several years ago, where we put subjects in a situation where somebody was saying something mean to them, and then we had somebody just walk past and say, don't pay any attention to him. And the only thing we varied is whether that was an adult or another kid who said that. What we found is that if it was another kid, then the subject reported that they felt much better. If it was an adult, they still felt better, but not as much. So here you can really see the power of how peers can really make things better or make you feel better. As kids grow, they naturally begin to gravitate towards using their peers as their support system. So as they grow, they're less likely to tell their teachers about bullying or cyberbullying. Similarly, they're less likely to tell parents about bullying or cyberbullying. And they're more likely to tell their friends. None of this is wrong. This is what kids are supposed to be doing. As you grow up socially, you're supposed to be using and developing those social skills to have new and different relationships with people outside your family. And that's exactly what most kids do. The other problem with saying to kids, just tell an adult, is that it really kind of removes the responsibility from other kids in the school. If you say to kids, if bullying happens, just tell an adult, you're kind of saying the adults will take care of this, it's our problem. And what you really want to emphasize to kids is that bullying is something that hurts the whole school community. And that is true, by the way. It hurts the whole school community. And we really want to emphasize to kids that they are responsible. If somebody's being hurt and they know about it, they should try to help them out. Another solution that isn't particularly effective, unfortunately, is mediation. Now, I want to emphasize mediation is the gold standard when it comes to fighting. So if two kids are in a fight or a quarrel, mediation is one of the best things you can do for them. But in a bullying situation, it's not likely to resolve the situation. So the bully may go along with it and say everything's great now, no problems, but the kid who's the target usually knows that now they've really made a mistake and they're probably really going to get it, and they shouldn't have told any adults about this. We looked at the impact of mediation on bullying situations in the real world, and we found that about 45% of the time, about 90% of the time, it either made the situation worse or had no impact. That's a terrible, terrible rate of success. A 10% success rate is a terrible success rate. I'm also not entirely sure if that 10% are cases that were really bullying. Remember, I said early on, mediation is one of the best approaches to use in fighting. Just make sure you're dealing with a fighting situation and not a bullying situation before you use mediation. Another ineffective approach, and this one I have to say is the one that I think adults like the most, is the idea of confrontation. And this comes in two flavors. You can encourage targets to confront a bully. These are sometimes called I messages, where you say to a bully, I don't like it when you say that to me. Or they can be a bystander confrontation, where a peer sort of says to a bully, hey, you cut that out right now, stop doing that. We don't do bullying here, something like that. Now, adults really love this. I think it makes them feel like kids are being taught to be assertive and resilient. Totally understandable. Problem is that it doesn't really work. It's not a technique that is supported. So if you look at the data from the Youth Voice Project, you can see the effect of I messages is that about 75% of the time, it either doesn't work or it makes things worse for the target. And the same thing is true of peer confrontation. The data is almost identical. So a 25% success rate is not a good success rate. So what do you do? If confrontation doesn't work, what do you do? And there are actually answers, and they actually have a lot to do with resiliency, interestingly. So we asked kids who had talked to adults when they were being bullied. We said, what did the adults recommend? And the two top answers by far are just ignore the bully or just decide that this bully has no power over you, which is kind of the same thing. And these two recommendations were by far the most common thing that kids said that adults recommended to them. However, then we asked them, well, what did you actually do that helped? Interestingly, what was really helpful was peer support. Just like I talked about in that experiment that we did. Peer support really helped. Sticking with your friends, telling your friends what's going on, talking with them, strategies, things like that were really the best thing. Now, you will notice that ignoring the bully is number 3 among the strategies that worked. But that was really true for the high school kids. High school kids, it seems like, can ignore a bully, and it can sometimes work. But the elementary school kids, it didn't work for at all. So what do you do with the assertive kids that you work with? What you do is you tell them to focus not on the bully, ignore the bully, but focus on the target. Focus on helping the target. So focus on getting them out of the situation, being nice to them, trying to be a little supportive. That's what really seems to be most effective for assertive kids.